This is a Culture Inject production.
Welcome to the Nevers Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the discussion and dissection of every episode of upcoming HBO series, The Nevers, from writer-director Joss Whedon. If you'd like to visit our website, you can find us at hbothenevers.com. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at HBO The Nevers. If you have any ideas for the podcast, interview requests, comments or questions, feel free to contact us at theneverspodcast@gmail.com. And if you're feeling particularly generous, consider joining us on Patreon. Benefits include the Nevers Podcast merchandise, entry into giveaways, personalised shoutouts, access to Patreon-only shows, currently Dollhouse Awakens, our revisit of every episode of Dollhouse, and so much more. Just search the Nevers Podcast Patreon. You can also download and stream the Nevers Podcast on Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Please rate and review the Nevers Podcast. It doesn't just feed our egos, it also helps us move up the charts and get our podcast channel seen by more listeners. And it just so happens we actually have a review. This one is from Spoiled Brat 254, who gave us 5 out of 5 on Apple Podcasts. They wrote, "Greatness has been achieved. First, let me say I've been a Joss Whedon fan forever. I think he's an awesome writer and has achieved so much with his work, making it on TV. I didn't know about the Nevers until my sister pointed me to this podcast, and after hearing and seeking the info out on Google, I'm super excited to watch. About the podcast, I think you guys have found a perfect balance. Your personalities really shine and keep me interested. I have subscribed, and I'm looking forward to the discussion when the show comes out." Thank you so much, Spoiled Brat 254. We'll try hard not to spoil you too much. By the way, you can now find the Nevers Podcast on Amazon. That's right, Amazon Podcast that has just launched has the Nevers Podcast as one of the very first podcasts up there. So go and subscribe to us on Amazon and whatever your podcast app of choice is, and help us rise right to the cream of the crop. I am your co-host Tig, and joining me today is Heather.
Hello.
We have a very special guest for you on this episode. We'll introduce them in a moment, but first, the news.
We do have news this time, which has been something we haven't had for a long time because of the, presumably the COVID shutdown. Filming has recommenced as of September 7th. The actors have been posting on social media about returning to work. Listeners can read all about it on a new blog post on hbothenevers.com. Dennis O'Hare, who is playing Dr. Edmund Haig, who was also an interview on the show, confirms that The Nevers is premiering next year in 2021. We don't know any more than that, whether it's going to be a spring or a fall release. We don't know what night or anything like that, but, Dennis probably knows what he's talking about. So we're super excited that it didn't get pushed back to 2022, which is what we were worried about.
Yeah, that would have been painful.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's introduce our guest, Stephen Beal. Stephen Beal is a writer and editor based out of the San Francisco Bay Area. He was a longtime freelance contributor to How magazine, which I am intimately familiar with as a designer, focusing primarily on software applications for graphic designers. He's former news and reviews editor of Macworld, which I'm also familiar with. And he's the founder and editor of the Steampunk Explorer, which is why he's here with us today, one of the top online destinations for steampunk enthusiasts. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
All right. Stephen's website, the Steampunk Explorer, is an online magazine with a resource directory for steampunk enthusiasts and creators. It's a great source of information on steampunk events, retail outlets, museums, eateries, galleries, etc., and also provides a calendar of events in North America and the UK. When did you launch your site, Stephen?
In 2018.
And how's that been going? Has it been super popular?
I've been very pleased with the results. The COVID outbreak has had a bit of an impact. Previously, I did a lot of coverage of events. I would do previews of steampunk conventions and steampunk festivals, and I would write reports, photo galleries, and things like that from steampunk events. And obviously, like so many other events, most of them have been canceled. Virtually all of them have been canceled. Right. So now what's happening is a lot of people are putting on virtual events. And so I have a calendar of virtual events in the steampunk world. And I also have a news column I run every week where I just kind of round up all the things that are happening in the steampunk world and kind of package them conveniently in a fairly quick read. That goes out every week, and that has a lot of readers. So that's what I'm mainly doing now on the site is keeping up with the virtual events and putting out this weekly news roundup. Is
it all you? Is the site you?
Almost all me, yes. I've had a few contributors over the years. Some photographers have allowed me to use their work, a couple of writers. Professor Elemental, who is a well-known chap hop artist in steampunk, has contributed a couple of commentaries which were illuminating and quite popular. But it's 95% me.
So while the site's primary focus is steampunk, do you cover any other stuff like science fiction, fantasy? I know there's a bleed over where things you're not sure, or it's steampunk is not, and we'll get into this during the discussion, that steampunk is not, a rigid set of principles. So
yeah, I definitely cast a wide net. So I would say that steampunk is the bullseye. But then outside of the bullseye, you've got these concentric circles. And depending on how far those concentric circles are from the bullseye, I'm inclined to cover them. I'll cover interesting things about Victorian history. I'll cover diesel punk. If it's interesting to my readers, if I think a steampunk fan would be interested in the news, I'm inclined to write about it.
So what made you a steampunk fan? Like, Tyeg's a steampunk nut. He wants mecha everything. So when did it start for you?
Well, it's interesting. I've been a science fiction fan since I was a kid. And I remember when I was, I'm giving away my age, but I remember watching the Wild Wild West, the original TV series, back in the 60s. And I was a fan of that, which... It was sort of like you were enjoying steampunk without knowing it was steampunk because steampunk hadn't been invented yet. But I first heard of steampunk, and actually a lot of people first heard of steampunk, in 2008. The New York Times ran a story in their style section about steampunk. And it's interesting because at that point, steampunk had been a literary genre, a genre of science fiction. The term was coined in the 90s, I believe, by K.W. Jeter. But when the New York Times ran this story, it had become a style, an aesthetic, and that got me fascinated. That's how I first heard about it. And then a few years later, I bought a digital camera, and I was looking for places to take pictures, interesting pictures in the Bay Area. And there's a big festival. Not happening anymore, unfortunately, called Maker Faire, which was sort of a big showcase for do-it-yourself projects. And they had a steampunk section. So imagine a big, sort of like a cross between a county fair and Burning Man and a science fair in a big a fairgrounds, like a county fairgrounds type of place. And you're wandering around and you're looking up, and all of a sudden I'm walking into this area and I see these strange characters dressed up as these Victorian characters carrying zombie-killing weapons, and weird, strange vehicles and accessories and things like that. And that was the steampunk section. And I had heard of steampunk, but I had never kind of experienced it live. So that was my real introduction to steampunk. And then I would go back to Maker Faire every year. And then I started going to a steampunk convention in the Bay Area. And just over time, I decided at some point that I wanted to start my own publication. And I said, steampunk's a pretty cool thing to cover as an editor. So that's how it started.
Cool.
Sounds like a hell of a festival. I wish I could have visited.
Yeah. Sadly, it's kind of defunct in a way. They revived the company that put it on went bankrupt, and then they got resuscitated. But the real big maker fairs, there were big ones in New York and San Francisco, are probably not going to happen anymore, sadly.
I know a lot of cons have taken it on the chin from this. Like, they depend on their events going like clockwork to keep revenue flowing. So, yeah. Yeah,
but in normal times before the pandemic, there was a steampunk convention happening somewhere in the world, or not, maybe not a convention, but a convention or a festival or some kind of get-together, at least once a weekend, year-round, someplace in the world.
And you have to figure the two most COVID-safe subgenres are definitely steampunk and cybergoth. There's gas masks everywhere in those situations.
Unfortunately, that doesn't help, and practically it started happening in March. There were a couple of fairly sizable steampunk conventions coming up. They were both canceled, just a week before they were supposed to start, and that began a domino effect. And one by one, they all fell by the wayside. And now even one scheduled there's a big one in Tucson that happens in March, and they've canceled for 2021. They won't be happening until 2022. So it's even extended into next year.
I mean, yeah, I know some of the cons that I go to are already starting to cancel stuff in March and April of next year because they just don't know if there's going to be a vaccine. And, a year of planning goes into each one of those. And, so I feel for the people behind those because it's so much hard work. And then especially last year having to cancel like a month or so before in a lot of cases.
And those huge refunds and ticket cancellation and everything. So that must have really messed up a lot of people's sort of budget planning and stuff.
It gets very complicated because they have hotel contracts and things like that. There are actually a couple of conventions coming up that are probably going to be canceled, but they can't tell people that they're canceled because of their hotel contracts.
Yep. That's why Dragon Con had to wait for so long to cancel.
Yeah. But if you think about it, a convention is the ideal spreader event, so to speak.
Oh yeah. I mean, even at the best of times, going to a con is risky business.
I would come back from Dragon Con when I lived on the East Coast every year with the worst con crowd I've ever had in my life. So people just packed and Dragon Con, tens of thousands of people at some point, in hotel lobbies and stuff like that. It's absolutely a super spreader event.
Sad, but better safe than sorry.
Right.
This episode of the Nevers Podcast is sponsored by Dead Good Tees, aficionados of the sci-fi and horror genre and creators of premium heavyweight t-shirts and hoodies that are built to last. Dead Good Tees ships worldwide, so whether you're braving the Arctic winds of the Yukon or strolling the beaches of beautiful Thailand, Dead Good Tees has you covered. Thank you to Dead Good Tees for supporting quality podcasting. Start shopping today at deadgoodtees.co.uk. And don't forget, you can follow them online at Dead Good Tees.
So, let's dive into the discussion for the episode. A simple question with an incredibly complex answer. What is steampunk? Yeah, that's where we're going. Okay. First, a quick summary of The Nevers for anyone who may not be familiar with it. The Nevers is a sci-fi series set in Victorian London about a gang of women with special abilities, relentless enemies, and a mission that might very well change the world. There are many definitions of steampunk. When you think of steampunk, images of gears and gauges, corsets, top hats, and goggles probably come to mind. But what is steampunk, and what is the origin of that term? As our special guest mentioned earlier, the term originated when author Kevin Jeter, or K.W. Jeter, as most would know him, not to be confused with his slightly angry brother Vegeta from Dragon Ball, along with Tim Powers and James P. Blaylock, are credited with originating the genre, although the label has been applied retroactively to many earlier works. The three students were working together at Cal State Fullerton in Orange County, California, where they befriended Philip K. Dick.
I love him. Jeter conceived of the term as a way of distinguishing him and fellow tech sci-fi writers from cyberpunks. The stories from Jeter, Powers, and Blaylock, along with some others, were considered the first wave of steampunk literature. The second wave featured more female authors, whom most prominent was Sherry Priest and Gail Carriger. Priest's Bone Shaker, 2009, is considered a major recent work in the genre, as are Carragher's Parasol Protectorate novels. Since then, steampunk has taken on a life of its own. It's a visual style and even a philosophy. It's about mixing the old and the new, fusing the usability of modern technology with the design aesthetic and philosophy of the Victorian age.
Today, the subculture is celebrated with fashion, costumes, music, festivals, art projects, and many, many conventions. Cosplay is a huge part of steampunk culture. It's a fairly large community of people who make amazing steampunk accessories, jewellery and clothing, plus pretty much if you can think of an item, they can steampunk it. It's awesome. Which they can sell through Etsy and of course at steampunk events. Many others have adopted steampunk cosplay as just a DIY hobby, which is pretty freaking awesome.
So Stephen, talk to us. We've gone through all the, what is, but what's your definition of steampunk? That's why you're here, to talk to us about your expertise.
Yeah, well, I have a fairly expansive view of it. I think it's one point that needs to be made is there's not like some council of steampunk elders that determines what is or is not steampunk. It's a very grassroots phenomenon, a grassroots community, and everybody has their own definition. There's it's kind of like science fiction. If you think about it, it's really hard to define science fiction. It's not fiction about science. It's not even necessarily fiction about the future, but you kind of know it when you see it. And steampunk is like that, but it's also somewhat in the eye of the beholder. There's an academic, an English professor in Canada named Mike Perlman, who actually wrote his PhD dissertation on trying to define steampunk, like what is steampunk. It was 300 pages long. Now
and I want to read it. Let me just get that. I'm like, ooh, I want to read that.
Yeah. Now he boiled that down to a blog post, and he boiled that blog post down to one sentence, and I will read you the sentence. So and he calls it not so much a genre, but an aesthetic. And so he said, steampunk is an aesthetic that mixes three features: techno fantasy, hyper vintage, and retro futurism. Now that raises the question, well, what do you mean by techno fantasy, hyper vintage, and retro futurism?
Right, absolutely.
Which is why it takes 300 pages to really, give it justice. But I think that's a pretty good definition. Other people have other definitions. I think it's helpful to maybe give a little history. As you mentioned, there were these three writers in Orange County who kind of got it started. And back then, it was science fiction set in the Victorian era. But since then, it has evolved and changed so much that does not really fit anymore. And I also would say it's probably not too helpful to get really hung up on the word steampunk. Steampunk was when K.W. Jeter came up with the name, he wasn't really intending to give it a formal label. It was almost like an off-the-cuff remark in a letter. Right. And at the time, cyberpunk was a real big subgenre of science fiction. So it's sort of like Watergate. After Watergate, every scandal became a gate. He was saying, well, steam power was the primary energy source in the Victorian era. So instead of calling it cyberpunk, we'll call it steampunk. But steampunk does not necessarily have to involve steam. And the punk, in cyberpunk, the punks were outcasts and outlaws. Steampunk does not necessarily have to involve punks, although some people would say it does. And that's a major source of discussion in the field. But like I said, you kind of know it when you see it. And if you read some steampunk books, you go to a steampunk convention, sooner or later you'll kind of have a sense a sense in your bones of what steampunk is.
So breaking off from that, I have a question, and we'll get to books later, but how does, I know these writers talk about how they, labeled the genre and kind of invented it for modern times. How does, philosophically, books like by H.G. Wells that were written during the Victorian era, but certainly have kind of that aesthetic going with mechanized kind of sci-fi way back before it was written nowadays, if you will.
Well, the works of H.G. Wells and Jules Verne and Mary Shelley, they're the most prominent, old time, 19th century writers who, are associated with the genre. They could fairly be described as precursors or maybe inspirations. But a lot of people would say they're not steampunk because one of the elements of steampunk is it's told from our perspective of the 20th or 21st century. And so, and that's kind of our cultural attitudes are a lot different now. We have we're much more aware of how the technology evolved in the future. And a lot of steampunk kind of projects current technology into the past. Like if you were to reimagine a 19th century information age, what would it look like? Which is the premise of the Difference Engine by William Gibson and
right.
And Bruce Sterling. So that's a big part of it. It's just that it's looking at, it's maybe set in the Victorian era, although not all of it is, and or the 19th century, because it doesn't necessarily have to have anything to do with Victorian England. But it's from our current perspective, our contemporary perspective, which we hope is more enlightened than it was back then. So that's
I don't know. These days is really testing it.
Yeah, well, yeah. But that's why a lot of people would say that Jules Verne and H.G. Wells are not steampunk.
It kind of feels like H.G. Wells and Shelley in that era, those writers were very much looking into the future and thinking of where their world could go, whereas steampunk is more about being in the future, looking back at where you wish the world had gone. It's like kind of the middle point between the two is
right.
The world where steampunk lives.
Yeah, no, I was talking about Mike Pershon before, and he had an interesting take on retrofuturism, which is what we're talking about. That's one of the elements of his definition. And he put it this way: steampunk retrofuturism is arguably more than just how the past imagined the future. Rather, it is the way the present imagines the past, seeing the future.
That's some Inception stuff right there, man.
Yeah.
Is there a central philosophy that people would kind of espouse about steampunk?
Well, again, that's all over the map. Some people do see a philosophy in the sense of being kind of a reaction against consumer culture and kind of the throwaway culture and doing things yourself. It's kind of a DIY aesthetic. But and there was a time when some people saw it actually as a counterculture. I don't think that's really so much happening anymore. I think for a lot of people, and certainly for me, it's really a pastime. It's a hobby. It's fun. You go to a steampunk convention, you might have some serious discussions about philosophy and aesthetics and history, but you're there to have fun, and they're a blast. If you really want to get hooked on steampunk, go to a festival or go to a convention. So again, there are all kinds of different viewpoints about steampunk, all kinds of different opinions. Some people would say there is a philosophy, but you don't necessarily have to adhere to any particular philosophy to be into the culture.
All right.
Pretty cool.
So let's move on to steampunk in pop culture. Steampunk in the Nevers, obviously, we only have one image that gives away that there might be some steampunk elements to it. Now, we've had a writer that will remain nameless that has referenced that there's a steampunk element in on the pilot. And Dennis O'Hare certainly kind of laid the groundwork that there would be steampunk elements. But all we have is a picture of this car. Do you have this picture up, Stephen?
I've seen this picture. I've seen it. It looks cool.
It does look cool, but it doesn't look like a car you would have seen in, they did. Well, I guess they did towards the Victorian era was vast. So we're cars, I guess Model A's came out in the early 1900s. So cars would have been a thing, maybe. Very
much like the discussion we had with Ruth Goodman about elevators, how they were not they weren't standard, but they existed. I think cars are going to be very much in a similar, people will know what cars are, but they're not going to be readily available. Whereas this thing looks like it's very much a custom build that some probably Pennant has made for the teams. It's going to be quite fun to see how they work that out.
Yeah, now you're obviously more familiar with the program than I am, but, there are all kinds of, with any kind of creative endeavor, there's questions about creative license. And,
Sure.
And one of the things about steampunk is that often steampunk is set in an alternate 19th century where you don't really have to be historically accurate. And so depending on whether the goal with the Nevers is to make it feel like it was really set in the real Victorian era, or take some liberties and maybe put it more in an alternate world. Obviously, there were not women with superpowers back then, or maybe there were.
Right.
We didn't know about them. That's a question I would have, is to what extent are they going to take that creative license or set it kind of in an alternate 19th century?
Historically, Joss's way is to stick very much to, now obviously Firefly's set in the future, but there are no monsters, there are no creatures. It's just people, right? It envisions a world where Chinese and American cultures have kind of blended together for hundreds of years. Buffy was normal, set at a high school and then at a college later. And there were monsters, but they impeded on every day-to-day kind of things for the Slayer. And it was supposed to be a big secret that this was going on. Same with Angel, same with Dollhouse. So my guess is, and especially at some of the dailies that we've seen pictures of the costumes and stuff like that, that they will stick very close to Victorian kind of sensibilities and authentic kind of dress, makeup, hair. I mean, you've seen people in costume that look like they're out of, one of the design books from the era. So we're not even sure how much, obviously this car exists. So the steampunk stuff is in there. We just don't know. We don't think it's going to be set in an alternative universe. We think that it's going to be, the universe with this stuff kind of being surprising and being hidden.
Well, I think that we are all looking greatly forward to it. I know that a lot of steampunk fans are really excited about the prospect of the show. And whether or not you call it steampunk or it has steampunk elements, it's science fiction, it's Joss Whedon, and it's set in the 19th century. Our people are going to watch.
Yeah. I mean, even if they don't literally apply the label, just the fact that we've got Dr. Edmund Haig, who we're getting very big Frankenstein vibes off of, and Penance Adair, who's very much a kind of Victorian Iron Man.
So, yeah, Penance Adair is one of the characters in the show, and the byline is she's going to be kind of the inventor type. She's going to be the Q, if you will, in James Bond universe. There's always one usually in these shows that depend on, the MacGuffins of the technology. So, in Dollhouse, it was Topher and Bennett Halverson. And in this, it's Penance. So what will she be doing? Retrofitting characters with mechanical body parts, maybe creating weapons, which I think is going to be huge, that she'll be creating gadgets, How do you like seeing these kind of things like steampunk incorporated into film and TV shows? Do you like it to be super deep? Do you like it, what would your ideal be if you were advising?
Well, I'm a science fiction fan. So, I mean, I'll watch stuff that has nothing to do with steampunk and I'll enjoy it. But then when you see the steampunk, you go, that's cool. And one example I'll give you, Guardians of the Galaxy, the second Guardians of the Galaxy movie, certainly was not steampunk, but there was a part of it was set on a pirate ship. And that pirate ship was totally steampunk.
Oh, yeah.
So much so, yeah.
The apparel that the crew wore, the decor, the interior design, totally steampunk. And so it has sort of seeped into popular culture, even though people might not recognize it as steampunk.
Right.
And when I see that, I go, okay, that's really cool. That's steampunk. But like I said, it's set in the 19th century. It's science fiction and it's Joss Whedon. We're going to enjoy it on that basis. And if there's any pure steampunk stuff in there, the gadgets or the costuming or whatever it might be, all the better.
Yeah.
I mean, and we know from some previous leaks and from a theory that I had that seems to have kind of slightly taken on a life of its own, the distinct suspicion that Amalia True, the main character, is going to be doing something fancy with an umbrella. Like there's been hints that she has an umbrella that is her constant companion that may be a little bit more than just a simple umbrella.
Wow.
And I can't wait to see a world created by Joss where the main character wields some kind of insane, superpowered steampunk umbrella that just like things fold out of it. And
that is very steampunk. And actually at many steampunk conventions and festivals, there is an activity known as parasol dueling. And so that is definitely a part of steampunk culture. And I would be really pleased to see that kind of element in the series.
I feel like if from the art that they debuted when they first announced it, it was like a crossover between, because there were cogs, but the picture was very prim and proper, a back silhouette of a person with a hat. And the first thing I thought was, geez, it's Mary Poppins meets steampunk, right? Meets Joss Whedon. And this is going to be crazy.
So ready for this.
So Matt and Ty both wrote steampunk blogs where they talk through their theories and what they think steampunk is. You can go to HBO, there's thenevers.com to read those.
We touched briefly on it earlier, but let's kind of drill into it now. There seems to be two main kind of big brains in the show. We have Penance Adair, who's very much working for The Touched, and she's, Amalia's best friend, described as like heretically progressive. Like she's clearly a real kind of forward-thinking lady. Then we have Dennis O'Hare's character, Dr. Edmund Haig, who seems to have some real Dr. Frankenstein vibes. We've heard talk of like a giant 2-story lab with like gadgets and tables and bubbling flasks and things. So how do you think they're going to handle the kind of science fiction versus science fact, sort of technology versus biology versus steampunk versus the limitations of the era? Like, how do you, is that a kind of a area you'd like them to explore? Do you think there's many stories to be had in that region?
Well, personally, I'd like to be surprised. I'll just see what he comes up with. And, creative genius is all about doing things you don't expect. Like I said, it's the setting, the era, the creative talent behind it. That all makes it very promising. And I am a big Joss Whedon fan. I love Firefly, Buffy, Angel, Dollhouse, especially Firefly. That's one of my all-time favorite series. And the movie, the Serenity. So if he can bring that kind of vibe to a story such as The Nevers, I'll be very happy, and we'll all be very happy. Now, one thing I'll say, there's sort of been a holy grail in steampunk. And it's not as popular as it could be. Part of it is that when you say steampunk to people, it's like a cool term. I mean, it's a really catchy term. But like I said, a guy wrote a 300-page dissertation on trying to define what it means. It's kind of tough for people to get their heads around, and it's tough to explain to people. And Sherry Priest, one of the top steampunk authors, made this point, is that what's missing in steampunk is sort of a touchstone where you can point to and say, you want to know what steampunk is? That's steampunk. And if the Nevers can be that, it would be great. If it's close enough to steampunk or has enough steampunk elements that people can say, when someone asks what is steampunk, you could say it's like the Nevers, or it's like this part of the Nevers, or this aspect of the Nevers. For older folks, people of my generation, I could say, remember the Wild Wild West? That's steampunk.
I loved that show.
Right, but that's lost on a lot of people.
I watched that show religiously when I was a kid.
Yeah. So now we had hopes for Mortal Engines. So Mortal Engines was a movie based on a steampunk novel. They kind of took a lot of the steampunk out of the movie, and obviously it was a flop. We had high hopes for it, and we thought, okay, this is the movie that's going to put steampunk on the map, and it flopped. So it was a big disappointment. Although I will say that even the critics who didn't like the movie, they liked the aesthetic. So they actually liked the steampunk part of it. They didn't like the story. Now, Carnival Row is another show that, and I think that's more successful. It kind of got mixed reviews, but I would argue it's more successful. That's something that people have pointed to, and it might be that a genre like
It's got a lot of high fantasy in it, though.
Yeah,
there's a lot of high fantasy in it as well,
but very much a steampunk aesthetic, and you might make a case that maybe steampunk is better suited for a series, like a cable type series or a streaming series as opposed to a one-off movie. So
100%,
yeah. But that's one reason why people have a lot of hopes for the Nevers, and maybe we're putting too much weight on that. It might be a little bit of a heavy lift for it to be carrying a whole genre like that. And I wouldn't want to be, you want Joss to kind of take it where he thinks it should go, but a lot of people have that kind of hope for that series, or maybe other series that might be in the works.
One thing can definitely be said for Joss is he tends to just take shows where he wants them to go. So I don't think he will labour too much under the weight of the combined expectations of a large part of
I would not expect that.
The community.
But even if it's close,
This actually brings us on quite excellently to our next question, which is, how would we like to see steampunk incorporated into the Nevers? Like, what avenue would we like it to be added? I think it does seem like we're slightly repeating ourselves, but it does seem like Penance is going to be the steampunk character. I don't think necessarily the show will have a huge amount of steampunk in it, because it does seem to be quite heavily Victoriana based, more like the social moral mores of the time. But I have a distinct suspicion the character of Penance is going to be 100% steampunk. There's going to be gadgets, giant kind of like the power loader from Alien, but all made out of brass and cogs.
Yeah.
She's going to be our steampunk lady, and I can't wait for that.
It's all about the aesthetic, and I guess the other thing I would say is, as I've said before, steampunk is looking at the 19th century or early 20th century through a contemporary lens, and you can't help but do that. If you're going to be making a 21st century production, you're going to be doing it from it's going to appeal to the sensibilities of 21st century viewers. And so you really can't get away from that. You're going to probably see, just based on what I've seen of the cast, you're going to probably see better representation of people of color than you might have seen in something produced back at that time. Strong women characters. And that's very steampunk, kind of reimagining the past from a 21st century perspective.
Why do you think Joss has potentially chosen to incorporate steampunk into the Nevers? Is it something that's kind of necessary for dealing with the era, or do you think he just wants to have more toys in his toy box to play with?
As the show gets closer to being ready to closer to release, I'm sure he'll be there will be interviews. He'll get to talk about it more, and at that point, at least we hope that people ask the question, and then maybe we can get some insights. If
they don't, we will spam him with letters talking about steampunk until he replies to one of them.
Yeah, now, I guess one point I should make is that because it's such a hard word to define, you're not going to... The people who do the publicity and the marketing for entertainment properties are probably not going to use steampunk as a label because it just doesn't work. Probably the majority of the population probably does not know what steampunk is. And so now what you will see is the media, which tends to be more sophisticated about steampunk, more knowledgeable about steampunk. You will see that term come up, sometimes even when it doesn't really apply. So you'll see steampunk mentioned in the coverage of it, but I would not expect to see that in the publicity surrounding the show.
And HBO never labels its properties like that. Yeah. It never called Game of Thrones fantasy. It never, his Dark Materials, which we'll talk about, has never been called steampunk. I mean, even though there's a heavy element in there.
Yeah, less so in the HBO than in the HBO version than in the Golden Compass, the original movie. And I would argue actually that the series is better than the Golden Compass, far better than the Golden Compass.
Worlds better.
Yeah. But there are steampunk elements there, but I don't know if I would even call it a part of the steampunk genre. Again, steampunk adjacent, as Heather has said.
Right. Well, they got away from the Victorian and went in, Art Deco, more Art Nouveau kind of direction. But that kind of what you call retro futurist thing is there.
Yeah,
so
yeah. They got the airships.
Lots of blimps and stuff.
Yeah,
they got the airships.
Can't spell steampunk without airship.
So speaking of popular media, we can run down a few of the books that are kind of, as you put it, touchstones for the steampunk movement. The first being Bone Shaker, and I'm going to admit to have not read any of these but the Difference Engine. Bone Shaker 2009 by Sherry Priest is considered a major work in the genre. And this is interesting to me. However, Priest is no longer active in the genre. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a little more background on that. Now, Bone Shaker was the first in a series. She called it The Clockwork Century. And it was very successful, but apparently, from what she's written, less so with the later novels. And one thing that writers have to deal with, this is their living, this is their profession, this is how they pay their mortgage or pay their rent. And so the latter novels were not selling as well, and so she moved on to, I think she's writing horror now. That's happening a lot. Gail Carriger wrote the Parasol Protectorate novels, and then she followed up with the Custard something or other. Custard Protocol, I think. At any rate, it was set in the same universe. So she has this shared universe called the Parasolverse. And so she wrote a bunch of novels and stories in this Parasolverse, but she just wrapped up the last one. And so I'm not sure what her plans are. She's kind of branched off into other subgenres of science fiction. And so she's very much a beloved figure in the steampunk community. And she's a popular speaker at conventions. She's got a big following that overlaps with steampunk. But I'm not really sure where she's going to be going, because she's got to make a living, and she's going where the market is. And so that's happening with a lot of writers.
Well, let's hope that the Nevers has enough of the genre markers in it that it'll kind of fix that for the people that are writing.
Yeah.
Because, that's what happens. Game of Thrones came out, and, Martin always sold a lot of books, don't get me wrong, for Game of Thrones. But I'm sure the TV show just sent, all of his books flying out the window on the bestsellers list, and stuff that's, Game of Thrones adjacent.
Yeah.
So
there are other types of media where steampunk is more strength. And I don't want to give the impression that no one is professionally writing steampunk. There are a lot of self-published authors in steampunk, and there are still some publishing houses, small independents and the bigger ones, that are putting out steampunk works, just not as much as they used to, and not necessarily marketing them as steampunk. But there are some graphic novels. There's a lot of activity with graphic novels, a lot of activity with games. Steampunk is a very popular aesthetic for games.
We'll be touching on that in a moment.
Yeah, and that makes more sense because of the aesthetic of it. Tyke, I'm going to let you talk about Difference Engine, because I know you're crazy about this book.
Yeah, it is one of my favorites. It's from 1990, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling. We mentioned it earlier, and actually I talk about it more in my blog post. It's an alternate history novel. It's widely regarded as one of the books that helped to establish many of the genre conventions which people today categorize as steampunk. It posits a Victorian-era Britain in which great technological and social change has occurred after entrepreneurial inventor Charles Babbage succeeded in his ambition to build a mechanical computer, actually his analytical engine rather than a difference engine. But yeah, it's one of those books that just, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I read it and I was like, I have to know more of this. I have to read every book of this genre that I can lay my hands on. And you were saying earlier that your kind of entryway into the world was Wild Wild West. For me, it was the difference engine. I really loved the idea of these giant clanking machines powered, controlled with punch cards. Kind of the way that it took what for then was incredibly modern technology and put this old school twist on it.
You know, I have a confession. I have read pretty much everything that William Gibson has written, except for the Difference Engine.
No way!
It is on my list, believe me.
But yeah, there are a few other books that sort of fit the theme. One you mentioned earlier about graphic novels being a big entryway for steampunk. Girl Genius by Phil and Kaja Folio. Brilliant book. It's absolutely worth Adventures of Romance Mad Scientist. Great book. There's, of course, we mentioned it earlier, His Dark Materials, which has now been reimagined as a series for HBO, and we saw a while back Psy as a fairly terrible movie.
The books were brilliant, though. The trilogy was absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, I was going to say one graphic novel. There are a couple of other graphic novels that are notable. One, of course, is The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Alan Moore. Now the movie of that, was kind of got panned, and he didn't like the movie. But the series is great. The graphic novel series, and there's also a series called Lady Mechanica by Joe Benitez that's quite popular. So again, because of the aesthetic, the steampunk really lends itself to visual representations. So there's a lot of activity. Well, I'll tell you one of my favorite, and you just got to love the name. It's an old story, but The Five Fists of Science, starring Nikola Tesla and Mark Twain.
Okay.
And taking on
that is a great title.
Taking on Thomas Edison and J.P. Morgan. Excellent graphic novel. So it's
sounds like rap battles of history.
I just kind of love that title, The Five Fists of Science.
Absolutely.
And I'd also like to give a shout out to, this one's not as well known, Boston Metaphysical Society. Which is by a writer in Los Angeles named Madeline Holly Rosing, and her experience kind of says a lot about where steampunk is. She's she's an independent author. She conceived the comic book or the graphic novel as an independent venture, self-published venture, but she did it professionally. She's got some serious writing chops. She has an MFA in screenwriting from UCLA, and
nice.
But she did the whole. She crowdfunded. There's a lot of crowdfunding in steampunk. She goes to all the comic cons, and now she's gotten picked up by a major distributor. So now you can finally buy her comic books and graphic novels in comic book stores. So
huge grass to have for
that. And so you see that a lot. Now she's been very successful at it. She got so expert at crowdfunding that she wrote a book for how to crowdfund if you're a creator. Yeah. So she all her novels or her graphic novels, she crowdfunds them. She raises the money. It's her full-time job. And then she goes to comic cons and science fiction conventions and steampunk conventions. And because she's from LA and she kind of knows that whole LA scene, she's got that Hollywood pitch. When people go to her table at Comic-Con, she goes, "Think X-Files in the Victorian era." And so
I mean,
you get that one sentence that kind of captures the essence and kind of gets people interested. And so I wanted to give her a shout out.
Another great book, which is sort of, again, we've used the phrase before, it's kind of steampunk adjacent, is the amazing Neil Stephenson's The Diamond Age. It's not the late 19th century, it's not Victorian era, but what it is, he says that we're in a future where one of the dominant socioeconomic groups, known in the book as Files, has deliberately embraced the values of the Victorian era and reinforces that choice by immersing themselves to the kind of absolute extent possible in a very Victorian aesthetic. It's not exactly steampunk, it's kind of cyber steampunk. It's a strange one to describe, but it is nonetheless an excellent book, as pretty much everything Neil wrote.
All the aesthetic, even the machines of steampunk, but they're all driven by nanotechnology, and you have a whole aspect of virtual reality as well, with body stages and stuff like that. It's a fascinating book, and some of the stuff Stevenson wrote this book 20 something years ago. And some of the stuff that he's written about has actually started coming into be. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have roll-up TV screens yet, but they're definitely in R&D right now, right?
100%, yeah.
The flexible monitors and stuff like that. And that's how they read papers in this book, newspapers. They still have the printed newspaper, but it's on a flexible computer type thing.
And another one, Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Not exactly steampunk, because as we mentioned earlier, they're kind of from that era looking forwards rather than from this era looking back. But, I mean, as much like the works of H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, etc., they're very much the perspective of the time they were written, but with a very steampunk aesthetic. So, like, would you include them in the genre, or do you think, as we mentioned before with H.G. Wells, they're kind of...
Most people would not. Most people who are really into steampunk would not necessarily call them steampunk. We'll call them more precursors or inspirations, and definitely of interest. Something involving Frankenstein or H.G. Wells or Jules Verne is definitely going to catch the interest of steampunk fans. Most steampunk fans have probably read those books. But also, Sherlock Holmes. There's a lot of crossover between steampunk and Sherlock Holmes, even though it had no science fiction elements at all. There have been steampunk versions of Sherlock Holmes, or steampunk retellings of Sherlock Holmes. But because they're written in their era, most people would not consider them to be steampunk.
One of my favorite graphic novels ever is Neil Gaiman. He wrote a book, but it was then converted into a graphic novel by another person whose name I'm blanking on because I'm the worst. But it's called A Study in Emeralds. It's the perfect trifecta of Sherlock Holmes, steampunk, and Lovecraft. And it's one of those books that you have to read it to really understand just how completely insane it is. But it's so good.
It's Gaiman anyway. He's just like,
fair point.
Just read it.
Yeah. Well, Lovecraft is another one who's kind of like steampunk adjacent. I would say.
Yeah, Lovecraft was bonkers, man.
Yeah.
Absolute dumpster fire of a person, but one of the greatest creative minds of his era.
Like, I had no idea till recently, his politics. Wow.
Yeah. Now, that reminds me, I want to give it a shout out to a TV series that's very steampunk adjacent, very close to steampunk. Not technically steampunk, but steampunk fans sure love it. The Murdock Mysteries, which is from Canada. It's a mystery series set in Victorian era Toronto. But the hero is a detective who's very science minded, and he's always inventing crime-solving gadgets really before their time. And there are a lot of historical figures that appear in the show. The first episode has Nikola Tesla, and it involves the current wars between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison. And I won't give away a spoiler, but there's a really key technology in crime fighting that the detective kind of invents with the help of Nikola Tesla in that first episode. But H.P. Lovecraft actually does an appearance, a young H.P. Lovecraft. And they handle he comes across as kind of a really kind of creepy, not all right character, but it is a hilarious episode. They kind of do an early 20th century take on goths. And it's one of the later episodes. Awesome. It's on Hulu. You can see it on Hulu, and it's also on Acorn TV. I highly recommend it. Murdock Mysteries.
I would totally see Lovecraft as a creepy incel guy.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite shows, and I know a lot. There's no pure science fiction in it. It is all based on plausible technology, but they go right up to the border, right up to the border, and it's a lot of fun. So another show I would recommend.
I have a distinct suspicion that the Nevers may follow a very similar path to that. It won't go too futuristic, but I can see Pennant inventing things that for nowadays would be considered perfectly normal, but in that era are like, what is she doing? We've mentioned a few times now, and you've kind of hinted towards it. tell us just exactly how much you loved the 1965 to 1969 steampunk masterpiece, The Wild Wild West.
Oh, man. Well, it was just the whole idea of doing, kind of taking the technology of that time and making it futuristic, and the gadgets and the characters. I think that one of the things that makes steampunk appealing to people, I think one of the things that made Wild Wild West appealing to people, it's a mashup. And there's something about mashups, taking two things that don't really have anything to do with each other and putting them together in a way that works. And so the Wild Wild West was basically conceived as, it was a Wild West version of James Bond. That was the original concept. And then it got a little more science fiction-ish as it went on. But that was, the original concept was take James Bond and put him in the post-Civil War United States. And give him a train and give him these gadgets and everything. Which raises another interesting point about steampunk. Wild Wild West was steampunk before there was steampunk. Another example that people often point to is the 1954 Disney adaptation of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Very influential on the steampunk aesthetic, even more so than the original Jules Verne novel. But one thing I have found, and it's kind of funny, I've run into artists like this where people will do steampunk without knowing they're doing steampunk. And there was I ran into an artist at Maker Faire, this guy in Nevada who made this giant mechanical squid. And it was amazing. He fabricated it himself. It was about 10 feet long, and it was all cast metal. And it had these tentacles, and there were these little cranks on the fence. It was surrounded by a fence, and there were these cranks, and you would turn the cranks, and it would make the tentacles move. It was the most steampunk thing you could ever see. And so he was telling me this. Now, at that point, he kind of knew that it was steampunk, but he told me he was building this thing, and his father goes up to him, and he says, "That's steampunk." And the artist, his name is Barry Crawford, he goes, "What's steampunk?" He's making this thing, and he's "What is steampunk?" And his dad says, "That's steampunk. What you're doing there is steampunk."
It doesn't get any more steampunk than a mechanical octopus.
Squid. It was a squid. But yeah. And so, but that idea of it's you kind of take that 19th century aesthetic and you kind of fuse it with something else, or kind of look at it from a contemporary perspective. It's very easy to do steampunk without realizing that you're doing steampunk. And the same with it, actually there was a mechanical octopus, and this thing was spectacular. It was called El Pulpo Mecanico. And if you Google El Pulpo Mecanico, it was a big hit at Burning Man, and it was at Maker Faire. It's this gigantic octopus that was made of scrap metal up in Northern California. It was maybe 20, 30 feet high. Oh, the tentacles kind of move. It would play this party music, and the tentacles would move with the party music. It had these eyes that would come out of its head, and it spewed fire. So the tentacles spewed fire.
Of course it does.
It beat to the music, and you can see videos and photos of this if you go on Google. And I met the inventor. It was a guy named Dwayne Flatmo. I was talking to him at Maker Faire, and I said, "So that is like a totally steampunk thing you did, El Pulpo Mecanico." He goes, "I had never heard of steampunk. After I did it, people told me it was steampunk, and he goes, but then again, it didn't have any steam, so I figured it's not steampunk." So that happens a lot. There's a lot of steampunk out there. People just don't know it's steampunk. And that's the Wild Wild West. They were doing steampunk before they knew that was steampunk.
Funny you should mention kind of steampunk that doesn't know it's steampunk, because the next TV show we wanted to bring up is actually an anime, and it's one of like the all-time most popular, most beloved series out there. And most people have no idea that it is just achingly steampunk. It's a series called Full Metal Alchemist. It's set in a kind of fictionalized version of Germany in sort of, it's never quite 100% sure what the date is, but not modern day. And the main character, Edward Elric, I won't go into details because spoilers, but he has a bit of an accident in the start of the first episode. He screws up bad, and he ends up losing an arm and a leg, and he replaces them with these sort of giant mechanical, awesome arm that my brain is blanking. Automail. They're called, like, a lot of people in the world have replacement limbs that they're called automail. And his best friend is a automail mechanic, and she makes him a new arm and a leg. And if you haven't seen it, anyone out there, I absolutely recommend check out Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, one of the most beloved series of all time, and is just, I'm not sure if they were deliberately trying to make it steampunk, but it's got the whole kind of 40s, 50s aesthetic, but with robots and steam and magic, and it's amazing.
That's just anime, that's just anime treads dangerously close to steampunk.
There's actually a lot of steampunk anime. Now, one of the great things, HBO Max has that now, has Full Metal Alchemist. And also they have the, nice. It was Studio Ghibli,
yeah, they have a Studio Ghibli channel.
And so I've been I had been reading about some of this stuff. Some of the Studio Ghibli movies are amazing, and there's one, I think it was Castle in the Sky. That's a classic steampunk movie. Because they're now on HBO Max, you can finally see them, and so I've been slowly going through that catalog. I'm really happy they decided to.
You'd really love if you haven't seen Howl's Moving Castle.
Yeah, that's next on my list.
Yeah. I'd say Howl and Nausicaa.
Nausicaa is on there. Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few more shows to round out the television shows. Penny Dreadful, which I have been meaning to watch forever because I love Eva Green. I didn't have Showtime, which it was on originally. It is now migrated to other places, but I'm in the middle of like 3 other shows right now, so it's on hold. So I have a sense of the Victorian style monsters being on this show, and that somehow Eva Green has a hand in inventing them. Has anybody seen it?
Yeah, it's a very well produced show, and a very well written show. It's one of those things that's not really steampunk, but steampunk fans like it. So you don't see the gears and the goggles and all the steampunk gadgetry. But basically the idea of Penny Dreadful is they took all these characters from 19th century literature and put them in one show and kind of reimagined, kind of built a whole new storyline around these characters. So there's a Dr. Frankenstein, and there's a Dracula, and there's a there's a Dorian Gray. Dorian Gray, and then there are some characters just made up for the program. And it's three seasons. Each season is kind of a self-contained story, but then they kind of build on each other. So it took me a little while to get into it. I had to be a little bit patient with it, but it's very well done, very well produced. Like I said, very well written, really good cast, good acting. So I would recommend it.
And finally, we touched on His Dark Materials, both the movies and the series. As Stephen said before, this version is, while well done, has gotten away from the roots of the steampunk book, which was much more set in that world, and even the movie that was set in that world, but had stripped out all the anima that was, and philosophy that was in the book.
If it's really well done, I'm not going to quibble too much about whether it's steampunk or not. If it's a well-told story, if the writing is good, the acting is good, obviously you like to see the gears and the gadgets and the airships and all that stuff. But if it's a well-told story, that's what really counts.
So let's move on to the films. We talked about 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea being another one of those steampunk before it knew it was steampunk type things. I remember seeing that when I was a kid, and then my parents, we were stationed in San Francisco. I'm an Army brat. So we were on the Presidio, and my parents dragged us down to Disney World down close to LA. And there was a 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea ride down there. And I don't remember much about it, except that it scared the crap out of me because they stick you in the submarine. and you have had windows. It doesn't exist anymore, I don't think. But I remember coming out of there being like, oh, there's a giant squid trying to kill all of us. But yeah, I haven't seen the movie since I was probably 5 or maybe 8.
Yeah, but one of the things about that movie that's been very influential was the design of the Nautilus. It was designed by a guy named Harper Goff, and that has had a big influence on steampunk design. And I was talking earlier about Maker Faire and Burning Man. One of the iconic projects that you could see at Maker Faire some years was the Nautilus submarine art car. And someone actually built and he got commissioned. There was a wealthy fellow who commissioned this guy to build this 13-foot-long art car that looked like the Nautilus. It was a faithful reproduction of the Nautilus at a smaller scale, and you could actually drive it around. So you drive it around Burning Man. It drove around Maker Faire. Really cool project.
That is freaking
Do you
awesome.
find a lot of the maker stuff, the big ticket maker stuff, just out of curiosity, is steampunk kind of ingrained into the DNA of Burning Man?
Certainly years ago, maybe less so now. But there's a book I would recommend if you really want to get into steampunk called The Steampunk Bible by Jeff Vandermeer. And he gets into a lot of the aesthetics of steampunk and the connections to Burning Man and Maker Faire. But there were just some iconic projects that are kind of seen as icons of steampunk that were first seen at Burning Man. So one of the most prominent. Now I'm in the Bay Area, and one of the benefits of living in the Bay Area is that a lot of the artists who make these big scale projects for Burning Man are in the Bay Area, and they would take their projects to Burning Man, and then they would show them at Maker Faire. Now I've never been to Burning Man, so I would see these things at Maker Faire. But one of the outfits that's a really interesting place is called Obtainium Works. So they make they have this whole mythology that they've built, but they make their stuff from obtainium, which is their word for things that found objects, basically. So their big project that they're best known for is the Never Was Hall, which is a 3-story Victorian house on wheels. It goes at 3 miles per hour. It is literally 3 stories tall. And if you go Google Never Was Hall, HAUL, you'll see videos of this thing. You'll see videos of it on the playa at Burning Man, or I've seen it actually at their studio in Vallejo, California, which is not far from me. But they've made all kinds of these wild art cars. So that's one outfit that makes these things. Now the Nautilus art car was made by an outfit called 5 Ton Crane, and another one of their claims to fame is the Steampunk Treehouse. Which was it was a tree with a tree house made of metal, and it got shown at Burning Man, and now it can be seen at a brewery in Delaware, Dogfish Head Brewery in Delaware. It's got this steampunk tree house in front of their operation, in front of their facility, and they use it for company meetings, for brainstorming meetings. If they want to get ideas, they go up and they sit in the tree house and they brainstorm. Those are some of the really iconic Burning Man types of things. These are huge projects. They go out and they get funding. Burning Man funds them. They raise crowdsourcing funding, and they have big teams of people who spend months and months building these things. So they're just really it's not something that one person can do in their backyard. Although you'll see some cool stuff like that too. But that's you just look and go, wow, that's just like eye popping. That's definitely a big part of the culture.
Yeah, I've had several friends that go that I've never been. I'm too much of a wuss to go camping on the desert for a week, but they have like these build weekends all year where they have a tribe or whatever it is, or a group, and they build their big projects every weekend, and it takes almost all year, and then they haul it out to Black Rock and set it on fire half the time.
Yeah. Now, if you don't want to have to deal with the desert, and if you happen to be in the Bay Area, there are a couple of events that happen. We can kind of get a taste of that, and they're both in Vallejo. Vallejo is a very steampunk town. the mayor of Vallejo, I don't believe he's the mayor. I don't think he's still the mayor, but the former mayor of Vallejo was really into steampunk. He would go to events in a steampunk with a steampunk hat and the vest and everything.
Nice.
But there's
awesome.
an event called the Titanium Cup Contractors Rally, where it's in July. Now, it didn't happen this year, but it's in July, and these people bring all these wild art cars and they do an obstacle course. Where they have to, first they contend with flying monkeys, and then killer robots, and then they have to go through Wonderland, and finally deal with zombies. And so it's just this real fun, free event at this park in Vallejo, where everybody just kind of goes and they watch these wild art cars do this obstacle course, and people dress up in Alice in Wonderland costumes and
that's
steampunk
awesome.
costumes. A lot of fun. And then in December in Vallejo, they have the Mad Hatter Parade, where it's half like a regular parade where you've got the high school bands and all that stuff, but then the other half is this wild, art cars and Obtainium Works they haul out their entire inventory of art cars and they have them go into parade. And there was another one of these Burning Man projects. Again, you can look it up on Google. Rhino Redemption, where this guy took a truck and he made it look like a big rhinoceros. With the big snout, the big nose, the horn on the front, and the horn spews out fire. And so
everything has to spew out fire.
Yeah, of course. It's like a Burning Man thing. And so again, early December, not this year, future years, early December, July, if you're ever in the Bay Area, or it might even be worth making a trip to the Bay Area if you're not too far. It's one of the things I love about living around here is there's all this creativity like that. But back to the movies.
So we talked about Wild West, the show. What was your feeling on Wild West, the movie? Because it was pretty, but I thought it was a dog.
Yeah, it definitely flopped. I mean, it was worth watching because it was the Wild Wild West. But no, it didn't work. And even the people who made the movie now acknowledge that there were problems with it. I think the director said one of the problems, if he had made the spider a little bit smaller, he thinks it might have been a better movie. I think it might have taken more than that. But there's one movie that's not on your list there that I wanted to mention, City of Lost Children, which was a French film. Really, really brilliant. The imagery of that movie was just brilliant and very steampunk. And one of the notable things about that movie was one of the stars was Ron Perlman, who's obviously a well-known actor here in the United States. Now, it's a French-language movie with subtitles. He did not speak French. He does not speak French, so he had to do all his lines phonetically. And I think I heard him do. I actually got the Blu-ray and with the commentary. And I think he says it sounds. I think he said it sounds like me doing French with a Serbian accent. But it's a
very Perlman thing to say.
Very imaginative. The visuals are stunning. I highly recommend that movie, City of Lost Children.
Atlantis Lost Empire. I've never seen it. It was 2001, co-written by Joss.
I didn't actually know it was co-written by Joss. That makes a lot of sense suddenly.
I think he
very
was
funny.
He was a cleanup writer, but yeah.
Now that's on that's a Disney animation, and now you can see it on Disney Plus.
It is, yeah,
and Treasure Planet too. So I had been, I had never seen either Atlantis nor Treasure Planet, but when Disney Plus came out, I subscribed and I got to watch them, and they were both good movies. I would recommend them both.
We briefly covered Gog and Compass, the 2007 film version.
Yeah.
Aesthetically, it was very pleasing, and the cast was amazing, but I thought it kind of missed the point with the script, and I really, really genuinely hated their changes to the end, which I thought was utterly pointless.
Yeah, no, I had not.
Well,
I had not read the book, but I got the sense from watching it that they just kind of compressed too much. You could just tell that they left a lot of it out, or they tried to do too much in 2 hours, so it didn't really cohere.
Well, and the whole point of the books was Pullman's viewpoint on organized religion, especially the Catholic Church, and that all got stripped out in order not to offend the movie-going public. And when you take a book like that, that's whole basis is the subterfuge in it is criticizing organized religion, it's not going to work.
It's kind of hilarious when they made the TV series. I was like, great, now they can make season 1 without cutting anything out. And then they made season 1 and added a bunch of season 2 in there, so they ended up dropping a few bits from season 1, which I thought kind of defeated the point.
Right.
But the first season was still very, very strong. And then Mortal Engines and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, we covered both of them. Do you have anything more to say on those subjects?
Yeah, it was disappointing. We were so hopeful about that movie, and we kind of knew that they had taken out a lot of the steampunk elements. But because they had signaled that in some of the interviews about the production with the director, but because of the pedigree, the people who were working on it, Peter Jackson, and you're thinking, okay, this is going to be the steampunk Lord of the Rings, and it was, some people liked it. I mean, I will say that there are some people in the steampunk community who liked it. There's some people in the steampunk community they'll like anything that's got steampunk.
There's always one, right?
Yeah. But no, a lot of people just didn't think it worked, and they also, I mean, they had real high hopes that this would be the movie that would put steampunk on the map, and what ended up happening is there was one guy in the UK, a critic in the UK, and it was kind of inedible. This is why they should never make another steampunk movie. Steampunk movies are inevitably going to fail, pointing to the Wild Wild West and Mortal Engines. And I guess my point is that sometimes movies are just bad just because they happen to be steampunk.
That's a very derivative way to phrase it.
You have to, when you start talking about stuff like steampunk or any sort of really highly specialized genre, you have to have somebody on the inside that A, understands the aesthetic, the genre, and B, doesn't have a bunch of producers mucking around in their vision, because that's where it gets in trouble. Is, you have this vision, and that's why, you see creative differences and people walk away from their babies, like they did with not Legend of Korra, but Avatar. They were going to bring it live action to Netflix, and Netflix started to try and change a bunch of stuff on them, and I guess they didn't have the legal ability to say no, so they walked.
Yeah. But I think the thing is, there haven't been that many real pure steampunk movies, so I think it's a percentage deal. A certain percentage of movies are just going to be bad movies. So, and I guess we just kind of look. Now, one movie that I would say is kind of quasi steampunk is The Prestige. And that was really good.
Yeah, very much.
David Bowie is Nikola Tesla. I mean, that's all you have to know to want to watch that movie. David Bowie is Nikola Tesla.
Utterly perfect casting.
That whole cast was bananas.
Yeah, I think saying that Mortal Engines failed because it's steampunk is a huge misnomer, because everyone I know, including myself, that has seen Mortal Engines, the only bits they liked were the steampunk bits. It was everything else about the film that failed. The lead actress was terrible. Hugo Weaving was just clearly sleeping through the whole... And it's like, people kind of have this idea of Peter Jackson being the guy that can come in and make these amazing genre films based purely on Lord of the Rings, but they forget that was a massive passion project that took like 6 years of development. You can't give him this book, say, yeah, great, you got 18 months to crap out a film, make it good. It's never going to work.
And it had no budget, and they rushed it to market.
Now, one thing I want to mention, just because we're talking about steampunk, and Peter Jackson is from New Zealand, and a lot of his movies are made in New Zealand. And I just think that no discussion of steampunk would be complete without mentioning the fact that New Zealand is bonkers about steampunk. New Zealand, it's an island of like 5 million, 2 islands of 5 million people, about the same population as the Bay Area, and they got steampunk going on all over the place. And so there is a town in New Zealand, in the South Island of New Zealand, called Oamaru, which is arguably the world headquarters or the world capital of steampunk. They actually have a museum there called Steampunk HQ, with a train in front of it that does all these not pyrotechnics, but all these lighting effects and puts out smoke and stuff. And they have a big steampunk festival there every year. And I know at least one guy, a fairly well-known steampunk maker, who just visited Oamaru. And he was ready to call his wife and say, okay, we're moving from Virginia to Oamaru. He had it all planned out. He was going to do his own business there. It's so, there's one activity that's a very popular pastime at steampunk events called teapot racing that was actually invented in New Zealand, where people do these radio controlled teapots and they race them around an obstacle course. And that was actually invented at a steampunk festival in New Zealand. So I wanted to give a shout out to all the folks there in New Zealand for kind of carrying the torch for steampunk, because they're really into it there.
I believe we do have a couple of Kiwi listeners, so if you are listening from New Zealand and you are a steampunk fan,
it's the Mecca. I'll tell you, a lot wherever you are, there are a lot of people who have Oamaru on their bucket list. That and Nantes.
Now, so do I.
There's a city in France that was the birthplace of Jules Verne that has this kind of amazing theme park with this gigantic mechanical elephant that you can kind of get on top and ride around. And that's another place. Two places that are on the steampunk bucket list are this town in France and Oamaru.
Yeah, so we've briefly discussed books, TV shows, and films, but as we mentioned earlier, one area where steampunk is absolutely exploding is in the world of video games, being as they are kind of almost the perfect blending of aesthetic and story. It's a place where steampunk is kind of almost guaranteed to thrive. It's a few major sort of games. BioShock Infinite is the one that usually springs to mind for a lot of people. And then Machinarium, which is a sort of side-scrolling puzzle game. Very, very indie, very,
love
very
that
good.
Game.
Yeah, I thought that would be right up your street. Do you want to talk briefly about Machinarium?
Well, it's it's a point and click basically. That it's a side scroller, but it's a mystery. That's you have this little kooky robot that has to go around and figure out puzzles. Right? It's very much like Myst, if anyone's ever played that. But it's highly stylized as a mechanical kind of steampunk looking game. Everything's very retro looking. And in a lot of cases, the puzzles are putting little machines and contraptions together to make stuff work.
Now you mention it, Myst and Riven were both also incredibly steampunk in their aesthetic, especially Riven. Like there was a lot of puzzles involving making steam machines work.
I was so addicted to those games. Oh my Lord.
Now I will confess, I am not a gamer. But the way I know about all these video games is I do this column I do this news column for the Steampunk Explorer, and so I always hear about these steampunk games when I'm compiling information for the column, and I kind of do roundups of the games and whatnot. So there's a lot of activity in steampunk gaming, and I do love the visuals.
Is, yeah.
I mean, they just go all out with the visuals on some of these things. If not the games themselves, at least the promotional art for the games. So there's a lot of action there.
The thing I like about Machinarium that you don't deal with in BioShock Infinite, Infinite. BioShock is very much an action game. It's a first person shooter. Machinarium is what they, the hardcore gamers would call a casual game. And you can take your time and find out what you need to. There's no pressure. There's no murder. There's no weapons. You know what I mean?
One of the things I wanted to mention about games, I should, because they're in the last days of their Kickstarter campaign, and they have a very ambitious goal that they're kind of short of meeting. So I hope they can make their goal. But there's an effort to make a Girl Genius video game. There's a game developer in Norway that did a game called Tesla Grad, and they have done a preliminary deal apparently to take Girl Genius into a video game, and it's on Kickstarter now. Their goal was $200,000, and I think they're like 2/3 of the way there. They got about a week left to go, so it's going to be down to the wire. But I really hope they make that goal and get that game going. They're planning to have it out toward the end of 2022.
Fingers crossed to that. And I know Matt would fly to England to kick my ass if we let the gaming section go without mentioning Frostpunk, which, believe it or not, is a steampunk game. It's a city-building survival game developed and published by 11-Bit Studios. The game is set in an alternate 1886 where eruptions of Krakatoa and Mount Tambora, the dimming of the sun, and other unknown factors have caused a worldwide volcanic winter. This in turn has led to widespread crop failure and the death of millions. Players take on the role of a leader, and they must build and maintain a city during a volcanic winter, managing resources, making choices on survival, and exploring the area around their city. to, try and write their own stories and find different challenges to undertake in the world. I've got to say, I am absolutely terrible at survival games. I can barely survive in real life. So, it's not really something I've tried to play, but I did briefly flick past it on Steam, and aesthetically it does look absolutely stunning.
Oh, is this that game Matt plays all the time?
Yep.
He has good taste in the aesthetics of games, so I'm sure it's really beautiful. All right. Do you have any other games, Stephen, that you know about? Like, do you guys play card games or?
I think. Oh yeah, yes, there are. There are steampunk board games and there are steampunk card. I believe there are steampunk versions or add-ons for Magic the Gathering. Yeah. So, but again, I am not the person to talk to about games. I just know about them from whether it's video or tabletop. There's a lot of gaming activity in steampunk and a lot of gaming fans, but I'm not the authority on that at all.
I think we'll have to spin that into another podcast.
Yeah.
So let's talk musicians, and I'm going to be right up front here. I've never heard of any of these people.
I've heard of a few.
Yeah, well, the best.
So talk us through these musicians, Stephen. Okay.
Well, the best known steampunk band is probably Abney Park. And they've been around for a long time. And also another well-known band is Steam Powered Giraffe. And there's one out of Florida called The Cog is Dead.
Is there a sound? Do they have a specific sound?
Not really.
Or is it more of how they look? I mean, how does that work?
It's different for different bands. There's not really a steampunk sound. It's not like goth or punk rock. Basically, a steampunk band is a band that plays at steampunk events. That's the simplest definition. But it's a little more complicated than that. A lot of them have they'll have some element of kind of vintage sounds as part of their sound, kind of old time sounds. Part of it will be the look, the style, the way they dress on stage. Some of them have steampunk lyrics.
I was going to ask, is it the subject matter that's retro or Victorian? Yeah.
Yeah, but everyone does it differently. So you go to a concert at a steampunk event, and there are actually steampunk events that are almost all music. That's pretty much all they are. But you'll get a variety of sounds. You get folky stuff. You'll get some hard rock. You'll get some. There's a sound called electro swing that's kind of popular, where it's kind of like 20 swing music, but done like real electronic. So, and then there's this fascinating and really fun kind of steampunk related genre called chap hop, which is sort of a steampunk take on hip hop.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I spent all of yesterday listening to chap hop, and it's amazing.
Yeah, the two most prominent purveyors of chap hop, both in the UK, Professor Elemental and Mr. B, the Gentleman Rhymer. And it's hard to describe. They have tons of videos on YouTube. They're just a lot of fun. They're just hilarious.
So this is hovering dangerously close to another genre that my partner's into called nerdcore, which is is hip hop for nerds, which they rap about video games and like steampunk is flying right into that area. So that overlap of adjacency. I think I've actually heard of Professor Elemental. So they're fairly big deal in the UK, at least in the indie music circuit. And a few others I just want to give shout outs to. Frenchie and the Punk, which is a duo that are very popular at steampunk events, and they've been doing a lot of virtual events. There's one out of Paris called Victor Sierra, which is kind of a steampunk diesel punk, and they kind of have a little bit of a new wave heavy metal sound. But for them, it's the lyrics and the dressing and the staging, the costuming. There's a solo performer named Unwoman, who plays the cello and does these amazing things with loops, and really talented composer and singer. There's actually a band out of Japan called, I think it's Fate Gear, which is an all-female Japanese heavy metal band.
Sounds right up my street.
And they're the only steampunk thing that they do is the get-ups. They dress up in steampunk outfits and do this really fast, like thrash metal.
Nice. It's like baby metal.
Yeah. So there's actually I got a listing of steampunk bands on my website, and there are quite a few of them. There are steampunk events, like I said, all around the world, particularly in the UK, in the United States, and Canada. And virtually every one of them is going to have a concert or a headline performer or something like that. It's definitely a big part of the genre. But like I said, it's not a sound. It's just more part of the culture. Some of these folks, it's their full-time job. It's not like they're just doing it as a side gig. So, it's a real fun part of it. The hip-hop is just... Go look up some of the hip-hop videos.
Oh, I'm definitely going to look up the hip-hop.
Madden Misfit is a relatively new one, and she's a female chap hop artist, which kind of chap hop, but she does chap hop electro swing. Wow. And Professor Elemental is in some of her bits, so she's a relatively new performer, but her stuff is also a lot of fun.
Professor Elemental has a track called "Fighting Trousers," which is just superb, and
they just do. Yeah, they do great videos.
Yeah, very much so. A lot of work is put into those videos. Steam Powered Giraffe have this absolutely bonkers track. It's 8 minutes long. It's called Captain Albert Alexander. And it's just the story of this guy who he was always obsessed with the ocean, and it's kind of his life story told over 8 minutes.
But there's also, I should mention, Alice Strange, who used to be known as Alice's Night Circus, is kind of an up-and-coming sort of a solo performer out of the UK. She does a lot of steampunk events in the UK. And again, a lot of really good videos. She's got a couple albums out now, so she's worth checking out.
So I just messaged my partner. I said, today I learned about chap hop. He said, oh my God, I've been trying to get you to listen to Professor Elemental for a decade, you jerk.
If you watch some of Professor Elemental's videos, even when he's not doing music, he's a very talented comedian. He's got, some people just kind of natural comedy talent, and Mr. B as well. It's just brilliant stuff.
All right, so and let's wrap this up before we go to listeners' letters. What do you hope to get out to people listening to this show, Stephen? What do you want? We've talked about what you think you want to see from the Nevers, but what are, representing your community, pressure, what are your hopes, and what do you want people to understand about the genre?
Well, I would say that to really get steampunk, it really helps to go to an event. And some of them are expensive. Some of the conventions can be expensive, but they're also relatively low-cost events. There are a couple of big free festivals, one in Missouri, in Hannibal, Missouri, and one in Waltham, Massachusetts. If you really want to get a sense of steampunk, go to a steampunk event, because they're just a blast. That's where you really kind of get a sense of what it's all about. And you can go on a website like the Steampunk Explorer, and there are other steampunk websites. I'm certainly not the only one, but you can maybe get a little bit of a taste of what the scene is like by looking at some of the articles, looking at some of the reports from steampunk events. You can find them on on Flickr. You'll find, if you look up steampunk on Flickr, you'll find a lot of photos, all the wild costumes and all the chicanery. So I think that's the big thing. And certainly we're all excited about the Nevers and looking forward to it and hoping it's a success. And so definitely we're looking forward to that. But I think my key takeaway is if you really want to get steampunk, go to an event.
Awesome.
Okay, we are now moving on. We've got a few cool letters here to answer. This one doesn't appear to have a name. It just says, hello from Pune, India. So if you are the person that wrote, please
hi, Pune.
let us know who you are. I want to first wish you a happy anniversary. I know that I'm several months late, but it's a milestone. Also, I enjoyed your episode on Victorian England. It was very thorough, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Well, thank you very much for the best wishes on the anniversary. Late is better than never, so it's always good to hear from our devoted fans. And I'm glad you enjoyed the Victorian episode. It was an absolute blast to record, so I'm glad it was as fun to listen to. But now, on to my question. I've been following the development of the Nevers, but I don't recall anyone suggesting that steampunk would be part of the show. I'm wondering why you think it will be. I thought the Nevers was going to be purely Victoriana, but apparently not. Thanks. Here's the thing. We're sort of pushing for the Nevers being steampunk because we hope if we say it enough, they'll listen. There's been a few hints, but
we do have clues. The car is a clue.
Yeah, the car is a clue. Edmund Haig's lab is a clue. And we've heard from fell sources that there may be more than that.
We've heard one of the writers drop the word steampunk.
We don't know how much it's going to be steampunk. We don't know if it's going to be just Edmunds, just Pennants, or if it's going to be a wider reaching aesthetic. We can't be sure, but I mean, personally for myself, I keep mentioning it because I hope if I do it enough, Joss will listen and just give me steampunk mechs. Because I need a world where I see an episode written by Joss where two people in giant steampunk mechs fight each other. I need it.
Yeah, well, if somebody asks, like, why is it going to be steampunk and not Victoriana? That's clearly someone who has a really specific idea of what steampunk is.
Yep, yeah.
Which is common. But if you have, I have a more expansive view of it, and if it's 19th century science fiction, it's close enough for me. If there's not a gear or a goggle to be seen, that's okay.
All right. I was really excited to hear that you were doing an episode on steampunk. Hell yeah, baby. Hell yeah, baby. I'm a hardcore steampunk enthusiast myself. I have even traveled out of the country to attend steampunk festivals like Stephen was talking about. Since we don't have them here where I live, how do you hope they use steampunk in the Nevers? Lucas from the land down under. Lucas. Okay, so I'm a costume drama enthusiast. I hope it's not a total takeover of the Victoriana aesthetic. At the same time, I think it will. I love the way well done steampunk looks when it's executed really well. It's such a brilliant kind of retro sci-fi look. So I hope it doesn't pervade everything, but I hope it's enough to give the show some wonder, some sense of futuristic capabilities. I know Tig's going to completely disagree with me, but go ahead, Tig. What are your hopes?
No, not at all, not at all. I think in the same way that Firefly was this great mix of kind of the cowboy feel, the futuristic feel, the American feel, the Chinese feel. It was this real kind of melting pot, this melange of about 4 or 5 different ideas. I'd really love him to do something similar, but keep the sort of the pure, in heavy air quotes, Victoriana. I'm all for historical accuracy. I'm all for kind of real world references. But then if you kind of, layer on like icing on a cake, if you add on a little bit of, some mechs, some cars, elevators, bubbly things, cogs. I mean, if anyone's going to be able to walk that line, it's Joss. So, I mean, and then, wrap the whole thing up in a big super powered ribbon. It's just my perfect show.
He's being more reasonable now. He's told me that he's all for it to be 100% just robots walking around smashing each other to pieces.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dream, but I mean, I know unless Joss was literally writing it for me, that would never happen. I would quite like the sort of heavy steampunk notes, but it doesn't need to be the whole theme of the show. Okay. Oh, this is a good question coming from Dermot in a place that isn't. Maybe Dermot's from Pune. No, maybe not. Okay. He has asked, how come steampunk was never a real thing? To which I would reply, because we don't deserve it.
I mean, what does that mean? What does that mean, a real thing? I guess I'm not getting the question.
I think he's asking why steampunk wasn't an era, like a historical era, even though the roots of it are in a historical era. I mean,
steampunk was described as the greatest era that never happened.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, why did it never happen?
Considering some of the things that happen in steampunk stories, that might be a good thing.
That is an excellent point. But I mean, I think really we would have to say the Industrial Revolution. The reason we never got real kind of steampunk is because technology advanced beyond the point where we needed to have steampunk. But I mean, personally, I'm still sticking with my answer.
That's the dichotomy of steampunk, because the two things in normal societal progression couldn't exist at the same time. I mean, you could stick to the Victoriana rules of carriages and casts and women in corsets, but with the Industrial Revolution, that tears that fabric apart. I mean, as a functional way of society, things have to move on. So, I mean, the sci-fi writers at the time created the underpinnings for steampunk, if you will. But as Stephen says, steampunk's a contemporary look back on something that never existed. Final letter. Hey guys, can you explain the difference between steampunk and cyberpunk? Which do you prefer? Also, do you think they're going to get the rest of the episodes of the Nevers film this year before another quarantine period is put in place? Thanks, Jamie. I hope so. They're filming right now. Let's hope they get it done before the second wave hits. Steampunk and cyberpunk, just because I have more experience with cyberpunk, I'm more of a cyberpunk person, but I haven't read a lot of steampunk, or watched a lot of steampunk that's worked, and we've talked through that on this show. So, clearly cyberpunk has been easier to adapt into, in some cases. We're not going to talk about Ghost in the Shell, the new movie. But yeah, I mean, I think they're two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. You've got the hyper-futuristic, and then you've got the retro-futuristic. So, I mean, I don't even know if there's a preference to be made.
I'll tell you one difference, and I'm a word guy, I'm a writer, and so this is something that occurs to me, is that cyberpunk is actually a good label. It's a fairly descriptive label of the literature. Because you've got the cyber, you got the high-tech, and you got the punk. You got the outcasts and the outlaws. And steampunk was a sort of an off-the-cuff, well, cyberpunk's big now, Victorian era had a lot of steam, so let's call it steampunk. And he wasn't even thinking that it would become a long-term label. But it's not necessarily all that descriptive of either the aesthetic or the genre. It kind of points around it or points at it or, gets around it a bit, but it's not all that descriptive. And so that's one... Just from an etymological standpoint, that's one difference that I see. And there's all kinds of other punks. There's diesel punk, ray punk, atom punk, silk punk, which is like Asian steampunk. And I just heard of a new one called archaeopunk, which is like ancient civilizations archaeopunk.
Nice.
Interesting.
So,
have you ever thought collectively about renaming it? Like, what if you had the chance to rename the genre and the aesthetic, what you would call it? Or is it just too far gone now to put a label on it?
Yeah, well, like I said, there's no council of steampunk elders that could kind of, it's not like the company. Now, there's a term, there are related terms. So the Girl Genius people, the people who created Girl Genius, they don't call their work steampunk. They call it gaslamp fantasy. Because they didn't really like the term steampunk, so they came up with their own, with another term. It's a very catchy term. That's the thing, and I like it as an editor, quite frankly, because if I'm looking for like steampunk news, if I put out a call, I do like a Google alert for steampunk. I'm not going to find a lot of stuff that's not steampunk. It's a very precise term in that respect.
Not so much for gaslamp fantasy, huh?
Yeah.
Google that, you get one thing.
Yeah. So, but it's kind of stuck at this point. It's a cool sounding name that doesn't really necessarily describe it very well, but I guess we're going to live with it.
Ty, cyber or steampunk?
Oh, I mean, they scratch different itches, so it's really hard to pick one in particular.
Right.
But I think I've read more cyberpunk, but watched more steampunk. So I'd say I'd prefer cyberpunk in books and steampunk in like games and stuff. Like Fallout is one of my all-time favorite games. I'd say that's a real kind of steampunk class. Although it's atom punk probably as well.
We have talked in, around, upside down of steampunk, and we could probably go for another 3 or 4 hours. Like, just knowing that there's a 300-page dissertation out there on steampunk, just,
on defining steampunk. Just on what is steampunk. It's 300 pages, so.
We want to thank Stephen for joining us. Please share with us your website and your social media connections, Stephen.
So it's steampunk-explorer.com. And if you go to the website, the social media links are there. They're pretty easy. Just remember steampunk-explorer.com.
It's a really well-designed site too. I like how you've dressed it up.
Thank you.
Plug the podcast, so pluggity plug. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, YouTube, and now Amazon. And click to subscribe for more Nevers-related content. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at HBO The Nevers. Our website is hbothenevers.com. If you have comments or questions or letters to be read on air, please email us at theneverspodcast@gmail.com. If you're interested in supporting us on our Patreon, go to patreon.com/theneverspodcast.
I would say Steampunk Explorer is an absolutely killer website title.
It is.
Thank you.
You really nailed it with that one. It's a great name.
Did you code it yourself?
Yes.
Is that all CSS making that happen?
Drupal. I built it in Drupal. There's a lot of
nice.
CSS that gives it the look. Drupal is the structure. The architecture is built in Drupal, and then the look of it is CSS. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming along and keeping us entertained. And
yes,
Heather,
Stephen.
thank you for coming along and putting up with my nonsense. If you want to, where can we track you down, if we so choose, on social media?
If you want to communicate with me, I am HMB@TMP on Twitter.
And I have been Tig, and if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm Tig@TNP. It's TAHEGATTNP. So, until next time, this has been the Nevers Podcast. And we're out. Woo! Okay, I'm stopping the official recording at just shy of 2 hours, so I kind of wish we'd wrapped it on to a little bit longer so we could get that neat 2 hours.
This episode of the Nevers Podcast was written, researched, produced, and edited by Matthew Yamanashi at Culture Inject Studios. The intro and outro music was produced by Guilherme Moraes. We are more than just a podcast. We're a fan community. You can keep up to date on the Nevers and chat with other fans by visiting hbothenevers.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Just search HBO The Nevers, all one word, and click that follow button. The Nevers Podcast is not endorsed by Mutant Enemy, Warner Media Entertainment, or any of its subsidiaries, including Home Box Office, HBO, and is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only. The Nevers and all names, pictures, and audio clips are registered trademarks and or copyrights of their respective copyright holders. They're coming. Are you ready?
Do you want to transition, Tyke?
Oh, yeah, I think that's...
Okay. I didn't know if you had anything else to ask, so I was just going to wait for a second.
No, sorry, I'm good.
All right, perfect.
Crack on.
It's how the butter gets made behind the scenes.